Do what thou will be the whole piece of law.
Welcome back, my spiritually aware third eye open viewers. I would like to bring to you today a message of healing, of cleanliness, as I can tell you I found a secret of the universe that not many people know about. What if I told you that inside something that you would think of so simple as music actually is manufactured? The music you listen to is an amalgamation of controlling waves and frequencies, because you can actually treat so many things with music and audio: psychopathy, social aggression, political corruption, genetic dysfunction, and cross-cultural degeneration of traditional values, risking life on Earth. All of these things treated with the power of music. Because this all came to me in a single stroke, you could say. I saw an image. Now, this image, I thought no different than any other one that I had seen. It had the Rockefellers, it had some weird thing that I had never seen before, and it was generally low quality. I thought, this is something that I can do. And I looked it up, and I thought it was going to be a very bland topic. And, I suppose I should mention it now because I wouldn't want to do something without your consent. This video actually does contain some healing frequencies for you, so as we listen, I will spare you the frequencies that you have been indoctrinated to believe are correct, and I will clean your genetic code and cure your political corruption with these healing intonations that you can hear in the background. So I'm going to be a little stare into the iris today. But that's just because I'm trying to heal you, Parroting Puppet. I know you've been through a lot. But as it goes down the road, you'll see that Parroting Puppet allegory is not misplaced. Not misplaced at all, as originally I had looked up A equals 440. Now, let's go over some basic terms, because I'm going to be throwing out numbers and you need to know what these numbers mean. A equals 440, also known as this pitch, also known as Stuttgart pitch, is an audio frequency that projects at 440 hertz. Now, why is this important? Well, because this is the tuning frequency for all other frequencies and instruments in a group. An orchestra will tune off of A equals 440 hertz. So the note A is played at 440 and everything else is tuned off of that. And I thought it was going to be a very bland video because I just thought, well, I just look into it, it's a little bit of, sometimes people in the old times used A equals 435, which was Austria's recommendation in like 1885 or like 1860, and a man named Johann Heinrich Schieber recommended A equals 440 as a standard in 1834. However, it was mainly scattered until the official adoption as an ANSI standard, also known as an ISO standard. By the way, if you want to look it up, it's ISO 16. And the American Standards Association put it in place in 1926 that A should be tuned to 440. And I thought that's where the video would end. But I was a little unsatisfied based on the fact that the Rockefellers were mentioned, and I had not seen any Rockefellers in my research, which led me a little astray as to where the conspiratorial angle came from. So, of course, my next thing to do was put into Google 440 Hertz Rockefeller, and I came up with an article on a Snopes-like website that says, this is a false claim made by this article, and I said, that's what I'm looking for. So the majority of this is going to be me reading straight down, not necessarily word for word, but I want to keep the order because the order is very important. I'm going to be general in some parts and I'm going to be specific in others, mainly because at a certain point, the doctor who we're going to be consulting, although I hesitate to call him a doctor, although that is his title, so I will respect Dr. Leonard Horowitz. He wrote this article and he has a little preamble that says, hey, I had some copyright issues with the previous one, so since that happened, I am going to not do that. So I have removed my copyright claim and feel free. So I am actually under no obligation to link any of his stuff, so I won't. If you want, it's an article called Musical Cult Control. If you look that up, it's the first thing you will find. But what makes this special? Yes, I can have an all-encompassing theory of how things work, but you need facts. states, and this is a very well-cited article. I'm not going to go through all of the cited articles because frankly I don't have the time, and I don't think you want to hear about it either. But if you want to dive deeper, just look into musical cult control, and it is a very well-cited article. As for the article itself, it says that it wants to detail events in musical history, and as I said, this is going from music as a medical practice, and from the article itself it says, this history concerns A equals 440 hertz standard tuning and the Rockefeller Foundation's military commercialization of music. The monopolization of the music industry features this imposed frequency that is herding populations into greater aggression, psychosocial agitation, and emotional distress, predisposing people to physical illness, and financial impositions profiting from agents, agencies, and companies engaged in the monopoly. Now, he's going to offer some alternatives in this article, but I don't want to jump the gun. I'm going to try and keep this nice and sweet. Hold on. My nice, comforting, healing tones are being interrupted by constant advertisements, so I need to do a little bit of a modification, quote-unquote. Put it up on my secure computer god frequency. There we go, that's a lot better. So, where were we? Oh yes, controlling people into committing crimes, question mark. It's a lot deeper than that. Don't let me boil it down to that. In the introduction, contrary to popular opinion, the most powerful quote-unquote hard science influencing society, politics, and economics is behavioral science. This is mainly what this article is going to be based around. I think he has a PhD in psychology, although I wouldn't put it past him if it were something else. He talks about flocks of sheep and how they can respond as a group. And another key thing that he's going to bring up a lot of throughout this article, well, before he goes off the deep end, in my opinion, is unexplained mass hysteria episodes, specifically around music. And he cites someone else calling a related public health crisis, quote-unquote, occupational mass psychogenic illness. And starting off, the background. This section is building the basis for what he is going to lay out, of course. It's the background. This is written like a scientific paper. You ever done a lab report? It's kind of like that. Leading with assuming the field of physics, including biophysics, is valid, and the universe, including life, is primordially constructed energetically, mathematically, harmonically, musically, impacts us physically very powerfully. This life is meditated vibrationally, really hydrosonically, through sounds effects on water. So the reason you can be mind controlled is because you are made up of water, which is one of the greatest bio-superconductors to ever have graced the planet. Now, if I've lost you already, I would advise you to just leave, because it's not going to get easier, and if you don't have a stomach for this, this is going to get really annoying real fast, because he's going to put forward, you know how people say, oh, either life 100% evolved, or life was created by some entity outside of our control. Well, this doctor hypothesizes, based on a few scientific facts that I am not going to check, because frankly, if I were to check every single thing in this article, I would be here forever, will put forward a theory of hydrosonic creationism involving DNA and structured water, aka people are made out of water, and I don't want to use the word intelligently designed, but DNA is made out of water. Water is like the most important building block in people, and water is the most susceptible to audio manipulation. Moving on to the problem, leading with a lot of people who consider modern music annoying. I'm one of those people. Many people become emotionally disturbed listening to certain types of music. I wouldn't go that far. But he then says, oh, these are the frequencies used for mass hysteria. And first of all, the first main thing we're going to mention is that he brings in a man called Mayer Amschel Bauer, aka who would found the Rothschild banking dynasty. So that's one. I'm going to keep a little tally for every other popular theory that he ropes into this, because he goes rapid fire trying to clear all of them in like one paragraph, because he's like, okay, the Rothschild developed plans for the creation of the Illuminati, advancing the mission of global domination through a network of central banks that their family and silent partners controlled. So that's like 4. And you can link the Illuminati to all these things that happen that are bad. Wow. And it's, of course, along with these, you kind of have to rope in the Western civilization has gone from the ascent of high moral values, focusing on centers of love, joy, purity, selflessness, to the descent of lower centers of consciousness like power, wealth, physical gratification, and the Enlightenment was actually a turning point because this is when they tried to rediscover their roots. And there's just another weird paragraph. Light and sound is generated and measured mathematically according to frequencies. It stands to reason, then, that we are engaged in a conspiracy reality in which ultimate power and control is waged bioenergetically, aka biospiritually, aka the real attempts at power and control are through the energy of life forms and the energy of life's spirituality. And being the most grounded that he's going to be, he goes into the Rockefeller Foundation and military music, where he actually starts giving concrete dates, where he says back in 1913, so before the American standard had been established, J.P. Morgan and J.D. Rockefeller, with their giant banks, used World War I and II to depopulate the world, effectively. It was a way for them to forward their wish of depopulating the world. And then asserts that between World Wars I and II accelerating during the 1930s, scientific studies in musical frequencies best suited for war making were funded by the Rothschild-Rockefeller Alliance. Also funded by the U.S. Navy. You can't forget the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy is going to be a giant boogeyman, and I don't know why this person is fixated on the U.S. Navy. Maybe he was a former service person or a failed serviceman, but whatever. And a major objective of World War II was not any of the other things you were taught in school. It was to pioneer the music that would control the populace in the future. He then goes on about how Rothschild and Rockefeller are connected to the radio industry, as well as the Department of Defense and the U.S. Navy, as well as pointing out that the Navy had a monopoly on radio production in World War II. He also brings up something called the Flexner Report, which is connecting Rockefeller to, let's say, Germany in the 1940s, which is a little shocking, but not really, because I was reading through this earlier, and all of the images here are just kind of flashbangs, because I thought this was, like, relatively grounded, but it gets worse as it goes on. And he blames the Flexner Report for the over-reliance on deadly and not curative medicines, rather than these audio frequencies. You're using medicine, how could you do this? They're deadly and poisonous. Sound familiar? And they were working on a connection of music to herd behavior. And he uses a phrase over and over again called the militarization of music, which is effectively music used for cultural manipulation. And he also states that the Burris Mayer, aka soon-to-be Rothschild, but I will call him Burris Mayer because that's how he calls him in the article, became convinced that, quote, audio control of human emotions was possible for a large enough portion of an audience to provide effective crowd control, a line of research that ultimately found irrelevant for the understanding of the artistic or cultural values of music, but obviously fulfilled a military objective. Now, he will move on to another section called the Sequestering the History of A equals 440 Tuning. And he talks to a Professor Tobias, who I'm not going to research because it sounds like Professor Tobias snubbed him, and sounds like he is very copyright protective. So I'm kind of just going to skip over this section because it's more topical. I want to get into the crazy stuff, so I'm going to try and save you the time. But honestly, it would give you more time with the nice healing aura. Feel free to just stay for the healing aura. My voice is actually tuned to A equals 432, which we'll learn about soon. The next section is called Bioenergetic Music for Mass Hysteria, which is how music causes these mass hysteria events, or what might be possible if it were to be taken to its natural extent. Dr. Tobias is credited with large advancements in how it's used, mainly with it being condensed down to the clear interest here seems to be in the dramatic use emphasized in bringing audiences with the use of sensory appeal of sound effects to states of mass hysteria, aka in common people language, using music to make you feel things. Have you ever felt something while listening to a song? That means you were being mind controlled into mass hysteria. And he claims that the first person to use this technology was Elvis Presley, followed by the British invaders, aka the Beatles. And he brings up some weird thing where the Beatles were barred from performing in a Middle Eastern nation, following an investigation that prompted the Education Ministry to include that the Beatles' performances caused hysteria and mass disorder, aka people liked them. And he also mentions Massoud here, that's another tick. Also pointing out that the Rockefeller Foundation is connected to anti-Semitism and Germany in the 1940s. Wow, what a big surprise. Gotta throw the Rockefeller Foundation under the bus. Not that I'm gonna go to bat for the Rockefellers. I mean, Lord knows they already have enough money. Okay, August 31st, 1951. By the way, we are past where A equals 440 has been stated, and he's never brought that up, by the way. He never talks about how A equals 440 is, like, established by this shadowy cabal. He doesn't even talk about the date in 1926. There's no intrigue. He just kind of skips over it, and he wants to talk about all these intriguing mass hysteria events. And he talks about a mass hysteria event where, in Canada, there was a large trampling. He also then goes more into depth how the Navy controls radio production, and how it never really released its grip on control over the radio in 1918. He also brings up a date in 1919 when Navy officials met with General Electric to develop an American-owned radio company so that the Navy could continue as a quote-unquote front. And the results of this were the National Broadcasting Company and a government-created monopoly in radio and television with AT&T at the front. I really need to soak in the healing aura. I really need to realign my chakras. Oh, wait, hold on. Getting ahead of myself. He also talks about Black Ops here. That's another one. And he says that the RCA, along with the BBC, have focused their initial studies on psychotronic warfare, psychological stress induction, and negative affective, aka emotional, arousal, mass persecution, herd behavior, and population control. And, oh yeah, this is where he introduces an inconsistency with commonly established fact, is he talks about a date in 1938, which he then says the year before A equals 440 was established, which is untrue, at least in the United States. But he talks about the president of AT&T looking at studies to, quote, control the emotional responses of audiences by mechanical means. And how it was a typical Rockefeller project. Obviously, it was just a monopoly funded by the government, duh. And how by 1961, the Rockefeller reports were no longer about individual institutions. They were more concerned with America's quote-unquote national purpose, that the people should be governed by the assertion that a, quote, prudent corporate and military leadership of the national security state could link guns, butter, and the new technology of missile and nuclear weapons production to the cause of freedom in the free world. Now, that ends that section, and we're gonna start taking off a little bit, away from all of the hard information. This is more of the soft, nice, pliable information. So listen to those tones as we keep flying upwards towards the sun. As we begin, the media applies military psychoscience. Rockefellers are behind it more, duh. At this point, I mean, if you're not accepting that the Rockefellers are deeply involved, I feel you're not paying attention. He brings up Congress in 1974, investigating a Rockefeller-directed bank stake. However, the main thing is that Congress recorded that the bank held stock in 28 broadcasting firms, including startups based in musical intelligence, and they acquired 6.7% of ABC, the broadcasting station, and they only needed 5% ownership to signify influence in programming. And when they say programming, they're not talking like, oh yeah, you can watch Word Girl. They mean a PSYOP, aka propaganda for socio-cultural engineering. Something that I am getting with this author that I don't get with Francis E. Deck is he just takes a term that is just the most obvious thing. You're like, oh yeah, TV show programs, duh. He's like, yes, programming. A PSYOP term meaning educational indoctrination, otherwise called propaganda for socio-cultural engineering. He just like blooms it like a lotus into a term that's way more malignant than it actually needs to be. And he does the Francis E. Deck thing, where he loves throwing in like weird jabs at people who I don't even know who they are. Because one of these paragraphs will start with, according to televangelist turned enemy of the pagan corporatist state, Pat Robertson. Jackson. Chase Bank is a wealthy shareholder of the Fed. Wow, what an amazing thing. Oh, they mentioned New World Order here. That's another tick. Classic abolished the Fed. That's another one. He also mentions how Burris Mayer, aka the future Rothschild, would measure people with a psychogalvanometer. Even if it gives a rough measure of emotional involvement, perhaps it's sufficient for his purposes. They also talk about how this newly developed musicality enabled a technicolor proof of affective public addresses, raising the possibility of greater audience involvement and the specter of greater audience manipulation. Because remember, as they get more involved with the sound, remember A equals 440, designed for mass hysteria and control of the masses, if you can get greater audience involvement, you can dredge those feelings deeper out of the consciousness and have them flower far more greatly than you ever could have imagined. Now, he's going to talk about introducing A equals 440 to professionals. Now, what that means is he's going to say beginning to end official adoption of governments and such. He says it started in 1910, motivated by a grant by the Rockefeller Foundation for the United Federation of Musicians, and he says it had zero impact and basically died on the floor. And he then says, well, we then tried it on the Europeans and it worked. Because they're manipulatable. Because the Rockefellers got them to the British Standards Institute and they adopted it in 1939, which is what his official adoption date is. And this is where I got flashbanged, because he's like, oh yeah, they adopted it in 1939, and the Rockefeller Rothschild Black Op officials employed Joseph Goebbels. And there's a picture of him in my article, and I'm like, what? What's he doing? What's he doing here? But yeah, he's very convinced that A equals 440 is linked to the start of the Second World War as well as Germany in the 1940s, and that all three of them, Rockefeller, soon to be Rothschild, and Germany, well, specifically through Igfarben, basically saying, oh, since the eugenics craze was on the rise, and Germany said, oh, this A equals 440 stuff is what we gotta do to be the master race of people, then Britain, obviously following along in the style of the time, said, yeah, that would be a really good idea. So then they adopted A equals 440 before the beginning of the war to help them win. In other words, quoting directly, in other words, the A equals 440 frequency was instituted at the precise time World War II preparations were being finalized by the petrochemical pharmaceutical war financiers. Which sounds like a line straight out of one of those communist songs in the Cold War. You know, it's the war ministers, they want this war, no one else does. It's the petrochemical pharmaceutical war interests. Now, it may sound like all doom and gloom, but I promise you, listen to these tones. We're gonna switch. I was going with the more naturally inclined A equals 432. Now we're going to talk about A440 versus A444, which is going to be his hertz of choice, as quite ominously, research and developments in musical weaponry, tuning in with dissonant frequencies, yielding the latest and greatest war-making technology for broadcasting mass hysteria, was finally instituted in 1939, spaciously adopted thusly. And he points out that there was another Philharmonic tuning of A equals 439, however, didn't last very long, as the BBC would adopt A equals 440 basically instantly afterwards. And he talks about a man named Kavanaugh, which is presumably a cited author, which he talks about how the tuning note is produced, and he goes into the math, and the tuning note at 440 was a piezoelectric crystal that vibrates with a frequency of 1 million hertz. It's reduced to a frequency of 1,000 hertz by electronic dividers. Then it's multiplied 11 times and divided by 25, producing 440. Obviously, if you do the math, I'm just going to take his word for it. As 439 hertz is a prime number, a frequency of 439 could not be broadcast by the BBC's means because they didn't have a crystal that could generate on 439. They have to have one that can be mathed to a number. Now, this is where we start getting a little spiritual, which was the second time that I was flashbanged while reading this article. Because going into this, he says, although the above detailed technical description for 440 pure tone generation using electronic generators that were militarily designed, remember military bad, and custom built for the networks may be valid, these historic facts have serious criminal implications. According to preliminary research analysis and professional discussions by Walton Cole Miller Reed et al. On the web. A equals 440 frequency music conflicts with human energy centers, i.e. chakras, from the heart to the base of the spine. Alternatively, the chakras above the heart are stimulated. Theoretically, the vibration stimulates ego and left brain function, suppressing the heart-mind intuition of creative inspiration. Boom, I'm dead. That is what happens. I take 3 consecutive gut punches, and I'm like, how could... My brain short-circuited. This article is tuned to A equals 440. This is like Rose of the World type stuff. And I also want to point out during this time, because he's going to go into C5 equals some other hertz, because that's the solfeggio scale, which is the ancient and original scale, which is like the best one, it's like the ancient Slovene scale. Because he runs a company called 528 Music, and he also links to a website called Healthy World News, both of which will advertise C5 equals 528 because that is their quote-unquote natural healing frequency. And he talks about how the interval between A equals 440 and A equals 444 actually creates what's known as a devil's interval, which, if you haven't taken your music theory, is just how to create the worst possible sound using only 2 notes, which is the most disharmony you can ever get when the 2 notes are played simultaneously, is the more complex way to say it, but just simply how can you make people feel the most uncomfortable when you play 2 notes together. And he reinforces saying, oh yeah, A equals 444 is more often found in nature, and he then goes to, why would we want to suppress A equals 444? Well, because it has to be suppressed because it stimulates spirituality, because they were using the miracle tone, aka a note played by the Pythagoreans. And this man, Helmholtz, can only describe this to us because he has recovered this suppressed knowledge over millennia, provided in a hydrosonic journal. And he also mentions here about A equals 432, which is what I was playing at the beginning. I am personally for all of my musical healing, I use A equals 432. Personally, A equals 444, which you've been listening to since I introduced it, is a little too aggressive for me. I prefer the lower, flatter frequencies. If you're an A equals 440 believer still, there's still far much to go. There's still much farther to go, as he then asserts that recording artists seek the ultimate musical expression reflected in divine human communion. Musicians who are spiritually sensitive to pitch are compelled instinctively to reject intrusions to pure creativity and harmony with the flow of sacred cosmic energy. This is where I'm going off the deep end, because I have to read this while looking at Da Vinci's Wu/Man. I'll get to that in a second. But he talks about that guy, remember good old Dr. Lloyd, an expert and leading critic of A equals 440, described his innate drive to tune up to a brighter and more soothing frequency. It's a calling to a higher pitch. You're not a real musician unless you work in A equals 444 or A equals 432. You're just some communist computer god puppet working in A equals 440 to brainwash the masses and bring about mass hysteria, just like the Beatles and Elvis. And then he talks about how he takes a grand piano and he tunes it to A equals 444, and he's like, wow, this is so much better. I could school all you people if I have this introductory grand piano with all your super grand pianos tuned to A equals 440. It just sounds horrible. A equals 444 just makes me school you with my beginner grand piano. And I would stake my entire 35-year professional reputation on it that you're wrong. You're just wrong, okay? Okay, Chud, you're just wrong. You're just wrong, Chud. You're just wrong. Or whatever. He also said that 528 hertz resonated most powerfully and enduringly. By the way, during this piano section, I have put in A equals 528, if that even is real. Oh, sorry. No, it's the same. Never mind. Now, the next section, A equals 440 versus A equals 432 standard tuning. He says, much ink has been spilled on this. Let's talk about a Fibonacci sequence. You know what a Fibonacci sequence is? The nice spiral that goes onto a bunch of things. It looks like a snail shell. It appears everywhere in nature, allegedly. He's going to center around a Brian T. Collins, who apparently launched a website dedicated to posting articles supportive to this growing musical metaphysical movement for recovering optimal spirituality through music. Of course, that's the reason why I'm listening to A equals 432. You know, those binaural beats to recover your spirituality, psyche, align your chakras to. And they're like 12 hours long, or they're just like ongoing live streams. That's like these people. That's like the spirituality you gotta get into. That's the headspace. And if you want something, I'm just gonna read a paragraph from this Brian T. Collins, because he's going to talk about A equals 440 as is the custom, bash it into the dirt, because remember, it's funded by the Rockefellers, soon to be Rothschilds, also Germany in the 1940s, and the US military, specifically the Navy, who put together all these false conglomerates to control the populace. Why wouldn't you be against A equals 440? Get with the program. Get with the program. The programming, aka the propaganda. Anyway, Collins wrote, quote, "The current tuning of music based on A equals 440 hertz does not harmonize on any level that corresponds to cosmic movement, rhythm, or natural vibration. Mozart and Verdi both based their music on natural vibration, and A equals 432 was nicknamed the Verdi tuning. Most Western music, including popular New Age music, is still tuned at unnatural A equals 440. The difference between A equals 440 and A equals 432 is only 8 vibrations per second, but it is a perceptible difference in the human consciousness experience." And he goes on about how the oldest uses of sound is for ceremony and religious purposes, and the purpose of music is to raise the vibratory rate of a congregation upward through a series of overtones. And then he talks about ancient Egypt. He's like, yeah, when you're at a church service, the purpose of music is to lift up the congregation and bring them all spiritually together. Anyway, archaic ancient Egyptian stuff. And then he says, yeah, this archaic ancient Egyptian stuff is tuned to A equals 432 in ancient Greece, which is like textbook musical location, predominantly tuned to A equals 432. Orpheus, the god of music, death, and rebirth, was the keeper of the ambrosia and the music of transformation, aka his instruments were tuned at 432 hertz, because I've met Orpheus. Because I just met him personally. I know him. He's like my G. And then he goes on about how you can make a bunch of different sound combinations and how they can all synchronize. Okay, this next section, if you're allergic to math, skip ahead to this timestamp, because I just find this math, first of all, intriguing, second of all, completely ridiculous, and third, I can't follow it at all. So if you're allergic to math, skip ahead here. It's not that bad, though, if you stick around. The next section is called A equals 444 versus A equals 432. So these are our two good frequencies, if I've been losing you in all the numbers. These are our two quote-unquote good frequencies. And starting off saying, it is readily apparent from simple mathematical analysis that A equals 444 and A equals 432 hertz are harmonically related and both reportedly therapeutic. Prove the harmony to yourself by simply subtracting 432 from 444. It yields 12, where 1 plus 2 equals 3 in Pythagorean math. Now take 528 and subtract 444. You also get 12, or 3. Next, take 528 and subtract 432 to get 96, where 9 plus 6 equals 15 and 1 plus 5 equals 6. The result is identical to 5 plus 2 plus 8 equals 15 or 6. It's like time cube math. I don't know what they're talking about. The sets of numbers, the 3s, the 6s, the 9s, the 8s are always exclusively represented by these special, natural, pure tones, their scales and their harmonics. This is what Leonardo da Vinci was talking. This is what he was talking about. Leonardo da Vinci actually was talking about sound the entire time. They bring up the Journal of Hydrosonics again, and the Rockefellers had to suppress this because only visual music is possible in these sound spaces. And now getting back into the evil dark waters of the US Navy, how they manipulated music. The US Navy's administrative control over the National Public Health Service in America, the forefront of war research including biological weaponry, virology, genetics, electrogenetics, DNA recombinance, technical developments in electronics, communications and signaling, and military intelligence, bearing on the subject of frequencies required for producing mass hysteria. That's like containment policy, mass hysteria. It really does read like Francis E. Deck, and that's why I love it. I read this and I was like, I have to include it. I don't care how long the video is going to be. I don't care how little visual editing there's going to be just to fit this all in. I don't care. I just want to have some more pseudo Francis E. Deck stuff before we get back to My Life Was a Deadly Nightmare. And this, why the U.S. Navy oversees and administers the most advanced science is why the U.S. Navy celebrity John Calhoun Deegan is credited for having allegedly persuaded the American Federation of Musicians in 1910 in its annual convention to adopt A equals 440. It all comes full circle. The Navy's responsible. Not the Navy! Then we go into the more broad one. I feel like we're straying off the road a little here because this one is purely just to bash the Rockefeller Foundation, in my opinion. It's called the Rockefeller Foundation and Eugenics, which, starting off, we can get another tick. The Rockefeller Foundation has been a prime sponsor of the United Nations Depopulation Program, where this is another one where they're going to sprint through a bunch. I'm just going to read the first paragraph of the Rockefeller Foundation and Eugenics. So, after that depopulation program, quote, terminating 6 billion people on Earth is their current objective. Ding. Although most people find this hard to believe, thanks to media propaganda, massive depopulation is being advanced by the world's wealthiest industrialists. Among them, Bill Gates, who promotes poisonous vaccinations. He lectures will reduce nearly 900 million people in the coming years, as shown in the documentary film Pharma Whores, the Showtime sting of Penn and Teller, which... Why? This is the part where I started saying, why does every theory have to be this all-consuming conspiracy? You know, why can't it just be the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers control music? It has to be the Illuminati, the U.S. Navy, the Rockefellers, Germany, and something else, I forget it, are all in control of a mass hysteria campaign to use musicians and A equals 440 to control the populace. And they talk about when A equals 440 was accepted, the Rockefeller Foundation founded the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry, as well as the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Eugenics, and Human Heredity. And they talk about how the Rockefellers led the eugenics movement because they appointed a man named Rudin to the president of the Worldwide Eugenics Federation, and they drew upon quote-unquote American racial hygiene, which this was kind of just a thing at the time. It's bad. I don't think I have to say eugenics is bad. Wow, hot take. But this was something that everyone was doing at the time, so vilifying people based off of what they were doing in their time is a little wrong. And another flashbang of German uniforms. As we go to the cult of militarized music, the wartime economy provided greater funding for musical research and development for opportunists with conflicting military and non-profit interests. And he talks about how John Marshall, the guy who would go on to write the Marshall Plan, wanted to commission a California defense contractor to develop wired music installations to deliver music-style ambient sound in movie theaters. And the purpose of this was to create corporeal synchronization, effectively syncing up your spirit and your mind together. Then it would double the effects. It would make it the propaganda and the sound A equals 440. It would make it so much easier for them to infiltrate your faculties and wear down all your defenses. Sound control, according to Tobias, worked for the Rockefeller Foundation as a general signifier of cultural, factory, and military industries in terms of both conflicts between trade and research and the Foundation's goal of developing non-profit educational, industry, and military and institutional networks. This is, in fact, the crux, the overall commodization of listening across educational, artistic, working, consuming, and military environments, the culture industries, with a commercial arm legitimating a broader control of the consciousness. AKA, all of these things you're consuming are just letting them control you more. Why are you paying for these things that will let them control you? Parroting puppet. And then he says, back in the 1500s, where Shakespearean plays were pivotal in advocating English as the new world language, the same thing is through music and through control of others. And they talk about the Rockefellers' deeper connection to Germany, which I don't think needs to be established more. There have been 2 more pictures of Germans in this article than I thought there would be at the start, so I mean, take that as you will. But now we're finally on to the conclusions, and the conclusion, I unironically probably could be a Francis E. Deck style reading in and of itself. I'll just read you some of my favorite parts. Like the start, the science of coercion, cultural indoctrination, and behavior modification has a lot to do with the world's current crises, history of military instrument tuning, and the media. They then talk about the Rockefeller Foundation and its involvement with the military, medical, petrochemical, pharmaceutical cartels, focus on acoustic science to identify sounds as useful in war, of course, the standardization of A equals 440, used throughout the Western world as advanced science and partnered with commercial and military investors during the first half of the 20th century, as well as Dwight Eisenhower warning of a beast, and infringements on economical, political, and even spiritual freedoms were mounting. Populations are now tethered like sheep by psycho-emotional attachments and addictions to whatever this cartel sells and promotes through radio and television. This amounts to enslavement for the conduct of genocide. Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift would be impossible if not for A equals 440. This, in some degree, he's tying to marketing. He's saying, oh yes, this cartel of pseudo-medicine, military, oil, and medical conduct, they advertise these things through the TVs, through the radios. A equals 440 allows them to infiltrate your mind, take over your senses, cause that hysteria, make you buy things. This is an enslavement of your soul. This military-industrial complex, rooted in the world of investment banking, has advanced a covert operation to control populations most loudly and profitably. Music bioenergetically affects your body chemistry. Psychoneuroimmunology and health. Your body is vibrating musically, audibly, and subliminally according to an institutionally imposed frequency that resonates in harmony with aggression and dissonance, and in dissonance with love, aka love, aka C equals 528, aka A equals 444. Love. They want to bring in this herd behavior, program it into your soul. These US Navy black ops engaging in consortium-controlled networks. All of these dark, dirty areas. Musical frequency ceases to benefit health, psychosocial harmony, and world peace. These have been suppressed in favor of the controlling aspects of A equals 440. These can, however, be remedied by listening to A equals 444 and possibly A equals 432. And he points out that many musicians, mathematicians, physicians, physicists, and even geneticists celebrate the emergence of truth about A equals 444 as a way to bring about love, broadcasting that universality from the heart of the electromagnetic energy matrix. What are they talking about? I'm losing it. Keep it together. Keep it together. We need to make it to the end. Keep it together. Ooh, listen to the calming resonance. Ooh, the resonance is so calming. Ooh. Thus, musicians, vocalists, and audiences are urged to discuss these findings, reject the militarization of music, aka music bad, aka imposing A equals 440, and they're like, oh, we're also operating a charity. And they end it off with, musicians and vocalists are the life stream of the music industry, and humanity's last hope for physical salvation and divine human connection, the spiritual musical portals through which planetary rebirth and harmonization is destined. Await your vision and activism. Now, I'll let you sit in the calming resonance pool for a second as I bring us out. Do I subscribe to this theory? Kinda. Not in the sense of, oh, the US Navy is being controlled by the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the remnants of the old German Empire to impose this psychosocial control upon others. But like, listening to the alternative Hertz music really is nice. It's a nice change of pace. I'm not expecting it to repair my genetic code like a lot of them say they will, but you know, if you want to believe that the world is based around water and you can influence your chakras with music, stay away from the radio. Lord knows they don't play anything good on it nowadays. Old man shakes hand at cloud. But if you appreciated the truth that I try and bring about the A equals 440 conspiracy and how you should only listen to A equals 444, A equals 432, my personal recommendation, I would also recommend that to keep wackos like me afloat, you like, comment, and subscribe. I am just about as well-cited as this article is, aka I don't use any sources that mean anything. So, all you need to do is support my ego. Resonate with me when I tell you that I'm made out of water, and I freak out when people start throwing a bunch of adjectives together. Honestly, I feel people who believe in this are a lot calmer than they should be. That's not a bad thing. I just feel like they're kind of bringing about that herd mentality themselves, honestly. Maybe before I ambush someone, I should just put on the nice, calming, deep healing melodies. And they'll be like, wow, I certainly am not being controlled right now. Then you jump them. But if I had to leave you some advice, belief is the most powerful thing that a human can do. So if you want to believe that A equals 432 or A equals 444 can repair your genetic code and foster love and bring harmony to your life, I personally think you should go for it. Definitely would bring up your quality of life by leaps and bounds, and in this economy you really can only afford to believe. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hopefully the budget will come back up soon. I understand it's probably gonna go for another week. I'm very sorry. I'm just trying to wrap up everything, but I should be free at the end of March, so only a month later than I said I. So in this economy you can really only afford to follow your dreams, and that's what I'm destined to do. So I'll see you next time. Bye.